pressing it right now. So we are going live. Let's just give it about 5 to 10 more seconds, and then Lana, we can start talking.
5 to 10 seconds. Good afternoon. My name is Lana Carlip, and I am a Vice President of the Nato Association of Canada, a charitable non-governmental organization dedicated to informing Canadians about the value of security and the importance of NATO. Most Canadians don't have to give a second thought about their peace and security. The NATO Association strives to remind our listeners of just that, and how this is possible through Canada's collaborative alliance dedicated to maintaining mutual defense and peace. As part of Canada's contributions to maintaining peace, we connect with our allies, and today we are going to have a discussion about the importance of U.S.-Canada partnership. Taking us through the discussion will be Eric Jackson and Adwit Sharma, two key members of our team at the NATO Association of Canada. After some prepared questions, we will be opening the floor to questions from the live YouTube channel audience. So if you're watching, please start typing in any questions that you may have. Before I pass it off to Eric and Adwit, I should remind you all to subscribe to our NATO Canada YouTube channel and to join our membership in supporting Canada's role in NATO and the rules-based international order. And with that, Eric and Adwit, please take us away.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our series of events discussing the future of North Atlantic cooperation. My name is Adwit Sharma, and I'm a research analyst and ambassador coordinator at the NATO Association of Canada. As mentioned, we are a not-for-profit organization aimed at educating Canadians on the value of peace and importance of NATO.
And my name is Eric Jackson. I'm a program editor for NATO in Canada and ambassador coordinator at the NATO Association of Canada.
We are honored today to be joined by His Excellency Arnold Chacon, the Chargé d'Affaires and Acting Ambassador of the United States to Canada. Thank you for joining us, Ambassador.
Pleasure, thank you.
Prior to his posting to Ottawa, the ambassador served as Senior Vice President at the National Defense University. His Excellency has held senior leadership positions in the U.S. Department of State, including Chief of Mission in Guatemala and Chief Human Capital Officer. The ambassador is also widely recognized for his expertise in the Western Hemisphere and European affairs, talent management, communication strategies, and building a diverse workforce. As Director General of the Foreign Service from 2014 to 2017, Ambassador Chacon developed strategic guidance for the Global Talent Management Bureau, responsible for the full range of human resources activities for the State Department's 75,000 worldwide workforce. As ambassador to Guatemala from 2011 to 2014, he implemented one of the largest economic development, counter-narcotics, and rule of law programs in Latin America. He was acting ambassador and deputy chief of mission in Spain and has had other diplomatic postings to U.S. missions in Italy, Mexico, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Honduras, and the United Nations. He has also served as the Deputy Executive Secretary of the State Department's Executive Secretariat and in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs and European Affairs. We are also joined by Jen Tierney, the Political Military Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy here in Canada. She has extensive experience with NATO and will help to answer our questions. Ms. Tierney joined the Foreign Service in 2006 and arrived in Ottawa in August of 2018. She has had 4 domestic tours, as well as overseas tours in Vilnius, Baghdad, and the U.S. mission to NATO. Ms. Tierney graduated from the Catholic University of America with a JD and a BA in World Politics and an MS in Strategic Intelligence from the National Intelligence University. She is a licensed attorney and speaks Lithuanian. After those wonderful introductions, Ambassador, we invite you to begin with some opening remarks before I pass it on to my colleague, Eric, to take it away with the questions.
Thank you, Adwit, and thank you, Lana and Eric, for helping to arrange this program. I want to extend my sincere thanks to the NATO Association of Canada for the invitation to speak with you this afternoon. While this is my first time addressing you, I know the association has had a long and productive relationship with the U.S. Embassy in Canada on a wide range of issues. Let's begin. I want to begin my remarks by stating the obvious, and that is the United States and Canada are the closest of friends and allies. In fact, we're more like family. We're deeply connected in almost every facet of life. And while we're two different countries, to be sure, we share many of the same democratic values and perspectives. So it is no accident that the first virtual visits by both President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken were to Canada. The roadmap for renewed U.S.-Canada partnership, which the President and Prime Minister announced on February 23rd, recognizes our common values and outlines now and continuing areas of cooperation for our robust bilateral relationship. The roadmap outlines 6 key areas: combating COVID-19, building back better our economies, accelerating climate ambitions, advancing diversity and inclusion, bolstering security and defense, and building global alliances. But for the purpose of today's discussion, I'd like to focus on the last 2 roadmap categories. They not only reflect how we address security issues together, but also how we cooperate in multilateral fora to advance our broader shared values and interests. As founding members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it's only natural that the United States and Canada cooperate closely in NATO. President Biden participated in his first NATO summit in Brussels on June 14th. He delivered a couple of clear messages on the U.S. commitment to NATO: threats from Russia and China, and the impact of climate change on global security, both of which align quite well with the roadmap principles. Prior to the summit, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also laid out, the U.S. objectives. And he noted that the president would communicate not only to allies, but to our adversaries as well. Mr. Sullivan emphasized that NATO formed the foundation of U.S. security, and that the United States considered its Article 5 obligation as a sacred guarantee. In addition, Secretary of State Blinken later signaled the president would call for effective defense investment at the summit. And while in Brussels, the president acknowledged that while COVID-19 presented a once-in-a-lifetime health crisis, allies also face serious challenges, including Russian and Chinese attempts to break the transatlantic bond, increasing cyber attacks, and climate change. During his meeting with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and the post-summit press conference, President Biden stressed that NATO is a strong foundation for our collective security and shared prosperity. He also asserted the U.S. commitment to the alliance was, quote, rock solid and unshakable, unquote, and that the United States viewed its Article 5 commitment as a sacred obligation. President Biden has famously declared, America is back, and he acknowledged in Brussels that NATO served as a key enabler for the United States in its conduct of global affairs. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg echoed these sentiments, saying the summit occurred at a pivotal time and that Europe and North America remained critical partners. Now, let me turn to a couple of key summit decisions and how we see NATO approaching those issues in the future. Broadly speaking, in their declaration, the leaders recognized the need to reaffirm or get back to basics and adapt some of those fundamental purposes for the new security environment. As we know, NATO came into existence as an alliance designed to protect allied nations from the threat emanating from the Soviet Union. And with the USSR's collapse and the implementation of the peace dividend, NATO stepped back from its original purpose and turned to other global security contributions. Over the last 2 decades, NATO has worked more in an expeditionary capacity, focusing outside the alliance territory. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and military buildup over the last few years have changed the calculus And once again, the Allies recognize that Russia's aggressive actions constitute a threat to Euro-Atlantic security. President Biden outlined the U.S. perspective at NATO ahead of his meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Geneva that took place on June 16th. President Biden observed that Russia's aggressive acts were inconsistent with what we had hoped Moscow would do. The United States would therefore seek a stable and constructive relationship with Russia, but we also retain the right to respond to Russian actions when needed to defend our interests and the interests of our allies. This thinking echoes Prime Minister Trudeau's characterization of Russia as a destabilizing force conducting misbehavior and interference, and aligns with NATO's dual-track approach to Russia of dialogue and deterrence. I know Canada has a significant commitment to Ukraine, including through its training mission with Ukrainian forces. NATO at the summit acknowledged continued support for Ukraine, which the Prime Minister and President echoed in their public comments as well. President Biden did make it clear that Ukraine still has some work to do in order to meet the criteria for NATO membership, including addressing corruption. As I mentioned earlier, NATO has spent the last couple of decades in expeditionary work, responding to counterterrorism threats, primarily emanating from Afghanistan. And while NATO is winding down the Resolute support mission in Afghanistan, as the president noted, NATO's relationship with Afghanistan will continue, but in a different way. While much of the presence will shift to a civilian one, NATO continues to support the Afghan defense and security forces. So, while NATO appears poised to return to its traditional origins, it also recognizes the need to address new, non-traditional threats. Of course, one of the biggest concerns facing the Allies is the People's Republic of China. At the 2019 leaders meeting in London, heads of state and government declared that China's growing influence and international policies present both opportunities and challenges, and that we need to address together these challenges and opportunities as an alliance. But since that time, the president has recognized publicly that China's behavior on the international stage has been inconsistent with what we had hoped and necessitated enhancements to critical infrastructure and dialogue with regional partners to address the long-term systematic challenges. NATO watchers have noticed the shift in language describing China in the 2021 Brussels Declaration, which noted that China's growing influence and international policies can present challenges that we need to address as an alliance. The declaration noted that NATO would engage with China with a view to defending the security interests of the alliance. And that's a dramatic change from the 2019 language, which left open the possibility of opportunities in such engagements. Leaders reflected on China's systematic challenges to the rules-based international order through coercive policies and lack of transparency, and they called on Beijing to uphold international commitments and to act responsibly. Some critics have asked why a Euro-Atlantic alliance should be concerned about an Asian nation. Secretary Stoltenberg observed in public remarks that, in fact, quote, China is coming closer to us. We see them in cyberspace, we see China in Africa, but we also see China investing heavily in our own critical infrastructure. We need to respond together as an alliance, he concluded. Prime Minister Trudeau echoed this notion in his call for an alternative to China's strong-arm tactics. These perspectives laid out the groundwork for the leaders' decision on resilience, which I'll address in a few moments. Allies also recognized NATO's role in addressing climate change through an examination of related security impacts. And this, again, is directly in line with the climate elements of the U.S.-Canada roadmap. Leaders adopted a climate security action plan with annual assessments and agreed to embed climate concerns in all of NATO's work streams. In the declaration, leaders charged the Secretary General with determining a plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from NATO facilities, without, of course, endangering military objectives. In line with the leaders' broader pledge to increase allied consultations, they also agreed to initiate a climate dialogue. Notably, Prime Minister Trudeau announced Canada's offer to host a Climate and Security Center of Excellence so allies could pool their knowledge and develop effective preparedness and responses to the security impacts of climate change. No doubt, with everything they laid out, one can conclude their leaders made extremely ambitious decisions. But how will the allies manage to implement them? First and foremost, leaders recommitted to fulfilling their responsibility as allies. In other words, reaffirming the basics, but with an eye to the modern security environment. Leaders in London in 2019 had charged Secretary General Stoltenberg with developing a plan to address NATO's future, and he delivered with NATO 2030. Both President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau publicly stated their support for NATO 2030, which will allow NATO to adapt to meet modern challenges. Leaders in Brussels adopted the plan, which includes efforts such as enhanced consultation among allies and with key partner countries. Also, a recommitment to the Wales Defence Investment Pledge, issuance of a new strengthened resilience commitment, collaboration on defense innovation, increased capacity building in partner nations, and agreement on a new strategic concept by the time of the 2022 summit in Madrid. Despite some initial opposition of some allies, leaders agreed to increase NATO common funding as necessary by 2023. I think we'll have to see how this piece of agreement progresses, given the follow-on work that leaders tasked to NATO and national delegations. Now, permit me to spend a few minutes discussing some of the key features of NATO 2030 in detail. Leaders adopted a strengthened resilience commitment, which builds on NATO's work since the 2016 Warsaw Summit. While NATO's three core tasks include collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security, leaders recognize that allies' Article 3 responsibility to national resilience underpins the alliance's deterrence and defense efforts. This is another example, I think, of NATO getting back to basics. NATO has offered baseline requirements as a framework, and the leader's statement noted the importance of allies' ability to operate collectively in peacetime or conflict. The leaders have tasked NATO with developing a proposal with resilience objectives to guide nationally developed goals and plans. They made clear resilience remained a national responsibility, and the goals and plans would be compatible with respective national competencies, structures, processes, and obligations. I think the leaders also intended to define resilience in a broader way to include things like critical infrastructure, supply chains, and energy security, all in the context of NATO allies' shared values. Leaders also recognized the increasing importance of cyberspace for the alliance and the increasing threat it faced from cyber attacks to critical infrastructure and democratic institutions. And they also endorsed a new comprehensive cyber defense policy. While it recognizes NATO as a defensive alliance, it makes clear the alliance will utilize the full range of capabilities at its disposal. Prime Minister Trudeau subsequently announced that Canada would provide cyber effects to the alliance. Leaders also reconfirmed their commitment to the Wales Defense Investment Pledge, and interestingly, linked it to allies' Article 3 and Article 5 commitments, as well as alliance cohesion, solidarity, and credibility. They summarized it well in saying that, quote, our overall security and defense depend both on how much we spend and how we spend it, end quote. The leaders also made note of 3 pillars of cash, capabilities, and contributions. However, they made clear that the cash element underpins allies' ability to offer capabilities and contributions to the alliance and its operations. I think it's important to note that President Biden publicly echoed the need for increased defense investment, reminding everyone that the United States has maintained that position consistently across administrations because the call comes directly from the American people. As I've noted several times, the global security environment has changed, and the leaders recognize this in their tasking of a new strategic concept. President Biden also stressed this point in his public comments before and after the summit. The existing 2010 strategic concept does not address China, and it contains woefully outdated language on NATO's relationship with Russia. It also does not account for non-traditional security threats, such as those emanating from cyberspace and hybrid actions. So the process of creating the new strategic concept will be an interesting one to watch over the next year. So let me bring this back to where I started. Our bilateral plan of action, as reflected in the U.S.-Canada roadmap, is consistent with Canada and the United States' collaborative work as NATO allies, as outlined in the 2021 Brussels Summit Declaration. In both contexts, our leaders recognized the changes in the global security environment and acknowledged the imperative to address them for our collective security. So I think it behooves us to stay lashed up quite closely in Ottawa, Washington, and Brussels to ensure NATO's work complements our roadmap goals. Thank you again for welcoming me this afternoon. I'm now happy to take your questions. But before we open the floor to questions, I would just like to say it's a real privilege to have with us today the U.S. mission or the U.S. Embassy, Ottawa's preeminent subject matter expert on NATO and political military affairs, Jen Turney, whom you met earlier. Jen has a wealth of experience, has been noted, including service in Brussels. So she, along with I, am happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for those wonderful open remarks. And thank you again, Ms. Tuney, for being here. We're very much looking forward to this discussion. And with that, we'll move on to our moderated discussion. I would like to remind everyone in the audience that we do have an opportunity for a live Q&A following this discussion. So we already have a number of excellent questions come in, but keep those questions coming and we'll be sure to get to as many as possible. With that, I want to turn to our first question, Ambassador, and that is that the United States and Canada has long enjoyed a unique relationship, which is forged by a shared history, similar values, and powerful multi-layered economic ties. How would you define this bilateral bond between our two countries?
Well, you know, I've been here for less than a month, but what struck me most was a quote etched in the stone walls of our chancellery here by President John F. Kennedy. He, as you may recall, addressed the Canadian Parliament in 1961. And I think his words are very apt for the relationship today. He said, geography has made us neighbors, history has made us friends, economics has made us partners, and necessity has made us allies. So I would say that our relationship with Canada is as solid, as a stone upon which those words are written. But in my opinion, this is a unique and a particular moment and very exciting for the U.S.-Canada bilateral relationship. I mentioned the roadmap, which President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau announced during their visit in February, their virtual visit in February. But that's a key document because it's a blueprint, if you will, for a whole of government relationship that's based on our commitment to work together on all of the areas of mutual concern. That roadmap, again, is divided into 6 pillars. And one of those pillars, of course, I discussed in my remarks, is bolstering defense and security through expanded cooperation on transatlantic security, continental defense, and in the Arctic in particular. It also includes modernizing the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD. Another pillar, of course, as I mentioned, talks about building global alliances. Both the president and the prime minister affirmed their shared commitment to addressing global challenges through multilateral institutions, including the United Nations, the G7, the G20, as well as NATO, the WTO, and others. But that's not all. Under the guidance of the roadmap, our governments are working hand in hand to end the COVID-19 pandemic. We're working closely again also to building back our economies. And we'd like to do so via inclusive, sustainable economic recovery that focuses on supply chains as well as clean growth driven by the workers in both our countries. I would say that we're also committed to accelerating our climate ambitions, including the launch of a high-level climate ministerial dialogue. And we also want to advance diversity and inclusion by addressing systemic racism in all forms of discrimination and doing so through inclusive approaches to criminal justice.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your response there. Certainly, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted how closely we can truly work together. And speaking of these relations, we have to address trade. I believe you already touched upon it. But our countries enjoy one of the most integrated and comprehensive trading relationships in the world. A secure and efficient flow of goods and people across the border is vital to our shared prosperity. What would you say is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our trade relations specifically? And what do you think can be done in the future to better manage such economic shocks?
Thank you. First, I think we should recognize how proud we should be that our two countries have worked well together in responding to the challenge that is COVID-19. And one of the principal lessons we learned was that the pandemic has really brought into sharp relief that our border is subject to unpredictable events. And we've worked hard to maintain critical supply chains and to keep the border open to essential travel. So that has, of course, enabled trade to continue to flow between our countries and for critical law enforcement and security operations to continue as well. All the while, we were able to do so prioritizing the health and the safety of our citizens. Again, it is phenomenal that throughout the pandemic, the United States and Canada, continue to enjoy the world's largest and most comprehensive trading relationship. And it's a relationship, of course, that supports millions of jobs in each of our countries. Again, when President Biden made his virtual visit to Canada in February of this year, he and Prime Minister Trudeau recognized that coordinated border policies remain central to controlling COVID-19 and new variants, while promoting, of course, economic growth and recovery. So both leaders have taken a coordinated approach based on science and public health when considering measures to ease the border restrictions in the future. President Biden is often said that if we're going to beat back COVID anywhere, we have to beat it back everywhere. And so not just with Canada, but there's a lot of cooperation going on throughout the world to ensure that we can get back to normal as soon as possible.
Certainly, and that's very much true. And really going off that, so your final remarks, that question, the United States and the European Union are charting towards a new sort of future cooperation for a new transatlantic partnership. Could you speak to the foreign policy priorities of the Biden-Harris administration in Europe?
Sure, and thank you for that question. We're here to talk about NATO, so I will speak in that context. President Biden's first visit, actually not first, but visit to Europe a few weeks ago marked, an important new chapter in the transatlantic partnership, and again, a reaffirmation of the United States' sacred commitment to Article 5. If I can quote, President Biden, he said it well in when he described the transatlantic alliance. He said it's a strong foundation on which our collective security and our shared prosperity are built. The partnership between Europe and the United States is and must remain the cornerstone of all that we hope to accomplish in the 21st century, just as we did in the 20th century. So I won't repeat the messages for my remarks, but I do think it's worth noting and reviewing the areas that are, shall we say, top of mind for the Biden administration's foreign policy in Europe. First, again, let's go back to the NATO 2030 agenda. With this plan, the allies are ensuring that NATO can meet its challenges that we face today, of course, and in the future. And the leaders agreed to identify additional resources, including through NATO common funding, to enhance NATO's ability to meet these security challenges. Second, let me go back to China, the People's Republic of China, and the long-term systemic challenges, that China activities pose to our collective security today. So we were very pleased that the allies are going to do more to enhance the resilience of our critical infrastructure around the world, including in particular trusted telecommunications providers, supply chains, and energy networks. Third, the new cyber defense policy. This is NATO's first in 7 years. This policy will improve the collective ability to defend against counter threats from state and non-state actors alike against our networks and critical infrastructure. Next, the allies agreed that our diplomatic, economic, and humanitarian commitment to the Afghan people and our support for the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces will endure. There's also, of course, the Climate Security Action Plan for reducing emissions from NATO installations and adapting to the security threat of climate change. And finally, the United States is looking forward to enhanced cooperation with our democratic partners in the Indo-Pacific, which to meet the challenges that exist there.
I think it's great that these priorities, such as climate change, as you mentioned, are on top of the US's list, because the world often looks to the United States to lead us in these matters. And speaking of specifically climate change, that is yet another such non-traditional threat that has taken the world by storm, quite literally. What would you say is the best way forward for the United States and Canada to address this rising security concern?
Well, I think everyone appreciates that addressing climate change is a core priority for the Biden-Harris administration. President Biden understands the critical role that the United States must play in the global climate effort, and for that reason, named former Secretary of State John Kerry as our special envoy for climate. We've wasted no time re-engaging the global community on the shared challenge, including at NATO. And as I mentioned, NATO leaders also tackled the climate change during the Leaders Summit. They agreed to their Climate Security Action Plan and set an ambition for NATO to become the leading international organization for understanding and adapting to the impact of climate change on security. And of course, they agreed to reduce greenhouse gases from military activities and installations in line with our national commitments under the Paris Agreement. And of course, to initiate regular high-level global climate and security dialogue. I must say that we were very pleased that Prime Minister Trudeau announced Canada's plan to establish and host a new NATO Center of Excellence on Climate and Security, and to work, of course, with allies as the center's framework nation.
That's excellent. And it is really important that as countries such as the United States and Canada, we move together towards addressing these large-scale security concerns, such as climate change, as it really has become part of that international rules-based order. And going off of that note, in times of peace, those who are dedicated to this international rules-based order must reaffirm that they're willing to stand up for multilateralism. So how can nations such as Canada and the United States grow our multilateral support from our citizens to address these international security concerns, as many of them sometimes seem a world away from us?
Excellent question, and thank you again for asking that. Again, let me reiterate that this is a strategic priority for the Biden-Harris administration and our whole approach to engagement in the world. But also, it is very important to the bilateral relationship between the United States and Canada. Again, referring back to the virtual meeting in February, both President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau affirmed their commitment to addressing global challenges and reaffirmed their commitment to the United Nations, to the G7, the G20, of course, and NATO and the World Trade Organization. I think this is the direction, well, I don't think it is the direction that we're following at the Department of State, based on the interim national security strategic guidance that President Biden issued in March. That guidance makes it clear that the world's at an inflection point and that we will only succeed in advancing American interests and upholding our universal values by working in common cause with our closest allies and partners, and of course, by renewing our own enduring sources of national strength. But it's very important for the United States to demonstrate clearly to the American people that leading the world isn't an investment that we make to feel good about ourselves. It's how we can best ensure that the American people are able to live in peace and security and prosperity. It's very much in our self-interest, and that is why we do it.
Certainly, that's a very good point, where the world isn't as realpolitik as it may seem at times. And sort of on that front, of course, you touched upon China in your opening remarks, and you mentioned the Euro-Atlantic Alliance and these avenues that the United States is pursuing. How would you say the United States and Canada are working to align our approaches in basically dealing with the rise of China, in addressing it?
Well, there is no doubt that the People's Republic of China poses the most significant challenge of any nation in terms of our interests and the interests of our allies. Secretary Blinken, I think, best described our approach to China when he said, it will be an approach that is competitive when it should be, it'll be collaborative when it can be, and it'll be adversarial when it must be. Again, referring to our meeting in February, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau discussed ways to more closely align our approaches to China, and including, addressing challenges that China presents to our collective interest and to the international rules-based order. This very much includes, dealing with China's coercive and unfair economic practices, the national security challenges inherent in this as well, and then of course the human rights abuses. All the while making very clear that we want to collaborate and cooperate with China in areas where it's in our mutual interest, such as climate change. And as you know, China was also a topic of interest in our recent NATO summit, and the leaders agreed that China's growing influence and international policies present challenges. And we need to address those challenges together as an alliance if we're going to defend our security interests. In particular, I would say that United States and the alliance are concerned about how China's stated ambitions rather, and assertive behavior present these systemic challenges to the rules-based international order and to areas that are relevant to alliance security. We're concerned about China's rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal, its military civil fusion strategy, and its military cooperation with Russia. So as an alliance, we're calling on China to uphold its international commitments and to act responsibly in the international system, including in space, cyber, maritime domains, in keeping with its role as a major power. I have to add that we remain very concerned and deeply alarmed by the People's Republic of China's continued detention of Canadian citizens, Michael Spavor, a former businessman, and Michael Kovrig, who was a former diplomat, and the decision of the authorities to hold closed court hearings for the two men a few months ago. We have and will continue to join Canada in calling for their immediate release, and we condemn in the strongest terms, the lack of minimum procedural protections during their 2.5-year arbitrary detention. So as many senior U.S. officials have said, we are treating the cases of the two Michaels as if they were our own.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And I want to say this has been a phenomenal conversation so far. We just have one last question before we turn it over to our live audience. I just want to make sure everyone keeps getting those questions in. We'll be sure to get to as many as possible. But the final question we have for you today, Ambassador, is how are the United States and Canada working together in advancing the rules-based international order, specifically in the Arctic, as that is a major area, major region going forward?
Well, let me address this briefly, and then I'd like to invite my colleague Jen Tierney to also come in, because she has been here for the last 3 years and has followed the Arctic as well. Clearly, the United States and Canada are both Arctic nations. And again, we're both witness to certain changes that pose unique challenges in the Arctic region. First, we are all seeing dramatic physical and environmental changes that are making the Arctic more accessible and open to new possibilities for resource extraction, seabed mining, tourism, and transit routes. Second, we're seeing increased geopolitical change and engagement in the Arctic by Russia and China. And we have to be watchful of what this could mean for the very high standards of governance, that we all want to see in the region. In brief, the United States envisions the Arctic region as one that's free of conflict, where nations act responsibly, and where economic development and investment take place in a sustainable, secure, and transparent manner. A manner that respects not only the environment, but also the interests and cultures of Indigenous people. So we see the need for a comprehensive approach to the Arctic region, as does Canada, and we want to give attention to the full range of U.S.-Canadian interests, including climate, scientific cooperation, safety, security, economic development, and the needs, of course, of Indigenous and local communities. And we will, of course, continue to champion an expanded U.S.-Canada Arctic dialogue. Jen, I wonder if you could address NORAD's potential role in all of this as well.
Of course, sir. Thank you very much. As part of that expanded U.S.-Canada Arctic dialogue that the ambassador mentioned, one particular pillar of that is continental security. Of course, we're in the unique relationship we have at NORAD, the world's only binational military command. And because so much of NORAD's area of responsibility includes the Arctic, There is an opportunity for NORAD through, particularly as we work to modernize it, to play a positive role in the Arctic, especially in regards to issues of sovereignty, territorial integrity, but also some of those issues that are not traditionally military ones in terms of investment in local communities and in critical infrastructure. With those thoughts in mind, as the United States and Canada have discussed the process of NORAD modernization and really defense investment in general, we are looking at different ways it can, the modernization effort can have a greater impact. So when you look at what does the military need to do in order to be able to facilitate the three core tasks of NORAD, you recognize that they need a lot of critical infrastructure in place. And frankly, the Arctic's a difficult environment. And when you're speaking to the communities up there, you very easily recognize that a lot of the infrastructure the military would have to put in place could benefit those communities as well. So we're looking at working collaboratively with those communities to ensure that whatever groups or entities are looking at NORAD modernization, we take the local concerns into consideration as well. A lot of the work that our respective militaries would also be doing in the Arctic area of NORAD's area of responsibility would also help not only local communities, but visitors to the region. Military capabilities are not just for offensive operations. They can be for things like search and rescue. And I think, unfortunately, all too often we see cases in which individuals traveling in those difficult regions require some type of assistance. So as we're thinking through modernization, taking a look at the other purposes those investments could have. And I think I'd be remiss if I also didn't touch on something else the ambassador mentioned, environmental sustainability. We have to do the modernization in a responsible way to take a look at the impacts, of course, of climate change, but also different elements that go to environmental sustainability. And that inevitably brings us into close cooperation again with the local communities, especially, to be frank, the indigenous groups that have lived in those areas for so long and really understand the land and the climate so well. So a traditional military program, a modernization effort, really looking at things in a non-traditional way, I think will set us up for the best success. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Chacon and Ms. Tierney, for your remarks there. Certainly, that is something that we're always trying to communicate here at the NATO Association, that while NATO is truly a military alliance, we have so much more that we can do through multilateral cooperation. With that, we can bring our moderated discussion to a close, and we'll now be opening the floor to questions from our live audience. And I actually have the first one here, and it's for you, Ambassador Chacon. It's regarding the USMCA agreement. So during its inception and even implementation, it was fiercely opposed in Quebec specifically, which sort of had reservations with regards to the US access to Canada's dairy industry. Do you think that the US, does the US believe that Canada's protected markets, for example, airlines, telecoms, are unfair?
Let me talk about the trading relationship in the sense that it's a win-win for both our countries. And I think evidence of that was that we just commemorated our first anniversary of the US-Mexico-Canada trading relationship, which is an incredible achievement that we had, and one that modernizes processes for dealing with, the irritants that are naturally going to arise in any trading relationship. So again, I would just say that all of these issues, again, can be addressed through that mechanism. And again, because trading is, the trading relationship is so important to both our countries, there are mechanisms for us to be able to sort out all of these differences and to continue to move forward. I believe in 2020, including Mexico, we had like 1.2 or $3 trillion in exchanges of goods and services between our three countries. And of course, you know, the lion's share of that is between Canada and the United States. So it is one of the most important trading relationships in the world, and we certainly value it. And we're very optimistic going forward that this new agreement, this new trading agreement, you know, will allow us to continue to expand our trade and do it in a way that, you know, enhances environmental protections and workers' rights and the like. So again, we have a lot to say by referring to that particular agreement, and the other issues that you mentioned, I think, will be taken care of in due time.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for those wonderful remarks. Moving on to the next question, it comes from our audience who very much thanks you for your remarks and thanks for this discussion. They're wondering if you could speak to the present and any future cooperation between the United States and Canadian navies in the NATO context or bilaterally in the North Atlantic.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Jen to respond to that because she's been here for the last 3 years. I can talk from my vantage point at the National Defense University, where again I was really pleased to have Canadian visitors from the defense establishment visit all the time, and of course having Canadian students there at National Defense University, where of course we talked at length about enhancing our defense relationship. But specifically with regard to the Navy, Jen, do you have anything that you might be able to add here?
Sure, of course, Ambassador. Just as the Ambassador referenced at the beginning of his remarks, our countries are so intertwined in almost every facet of life. I'd say that's certainly true with our respective militaries, to include the navies. And coming from a Navy family, I have a special appreciation for this. It's not often that our service members and sailors are overseas where they aren't working in cooperation with our Canadian friends and partners. There's a couple of pieces that I would highlight. As the Ambassador mentioned his time at NDU, our navies are inextricably linked in their professional development, in their professional training. So they're looking at lifelong friendships, lifelong cooperation. They're attending professional military education together, and as they rise through the senior ranks, they are staying in touch. And suddenly they're in charge of each other's navies, and they're looking at natural partnerships. How can we work more closely together? So I want to stress that the importance of the relationships that our soldiers and sailors have over decades, frankly, as they go through their respective military careers. In terms of cooperation, they certainly have an important role in continental defense. Quite often, folks tend to focus on the air and even the space elements of NORAD. But we're also looking at maritime. So our navies are in close cooperation, not only for defending our North America if needed, but also keeping that awareness, that information awareness piece that hopefully staves off any type of conflict. Our navies are doing that every day. Through our cooperation at NORAD and our bilateral Navy exchanges. I'd also like to highlight a couple of pieces in NATO. Our navies often cooperate in NATO operations. So I know at various points, the United States and Canada have led some of the standing maritime groups under NATO auspices. So they're taking that, I think at one point the US Navy slogan was a force for good. Both navies are taking that more globally by participating in not only NATO exercises, but NATO operations from a naval perspective, helping to bring safety and security to areas of the Mediterranean and other elements of the European theater of the alliance. Bilaterally, I'd have to say what strikes me as the most interesting and critical. We talk quite a bit, the language used to be the rebalance to Asia, but as we're talking about the Indo-Pacific and turning our eye more toward the Indo-Pacific, there's quite a lot that our navies are doing together in that regard as well. Folks may be familiar with Canada's OPNION, which is Canada's contribution to really the enforcement of UN resolutions against the DPRK. And the United States and Canada, along with other allied navies and frankly air forces, are working to ensure the rules-based international order is respected in the form of the UN Security Council resolutions. So through that critical work in OPNION and the U.S. Navy contributions, we're helping to ensure that there is peace in and around the Korean Peninsula. I don't want to delve too deeply, but there's also a lot our respective navies have done in the South China Sea and the areas of the Taiwan Straits. As we are making sales through those regions, I won't use the term freedom of navigation operation because not all sales are FONOPs. But as we have additional presence in that region, our navies are showing the importance of the rules-based international order for warships even to pass through different waterways, international waterways in a peaceful manner. So those are just a couple of key ways I think that our navies cooperate on a daily basis, and those will continue. They're always looking for more to do, but there's a lot of important work going on out there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for your in-depth remarks there. If I could just squeeze in one quick question, we want to be mindful of your time. It's about exactly what you just mentioned about sort of the South China Sea, that international aspect. And it's here, it talks about, though Canada and the United States remain key allies within NATO, what is the policy of the United States on Canadian participation in the quadrilateral security dialogue as a tool to combating China? Does the US support Canadian desires to join the Quad?
I think we're so lashed up on so many levels that I think Canada's influence will be felt in that organization as well. I'm not an expert, and I believe you're talking about Japan, India, Australia, and the United States in that area of the world. But again, through NATO, through the G7, through the United Nations, I think there are many forums where Canada's input is valued and will continue. But I cannot speak for my government at this point about those organizations. Often, expanding organizations makes them less effective. And so I don't think, given our special relationship with Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, that Canada won't be brought in to the most important aspects of that particular grouping. And so that's what I would say about including Canada in those bodies.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And with that, I'd like to sort of bring our discussion to a close and pass it over to our wonderful Vice President, Lana, to conclude this wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Eric. First and foremost, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for your opening presentation. And of course, Eric and Adwood for guiding us through such an interesting discussion. I have one last question for both of our guests, if you will, just to circle quickly back to something that was mentioned initially in the opening remarks, having to do with equality, diversity, and inclusion. And it was mentioned on a number of comments that our countries are so intertwined, academically, politically, strategically. And so I'm wondering, what is the present approach, I suppose, in this predominantly male-dominated public service spectrum in the public service careers, and how can women become part of the security and defense field, and just combat through these male-dominated roles and onwards.
Thank you, Lana. And of course, I would love Jen to answer this, but let me begin by saying that we have a lot to learn from Canada. You have a cabinet that, reflects, the gender and ethnic makeup of your wonderful country. And we see that and we observe it and we see how important that is. I would just note, as Director General of the Foreign Service, again, it was my goal to get out there and compete for talent. And we have a wonderful Foreign Service, but it could be so much better if it reflected truly the true composition of America, make it look more like America. And so we had some specific initiatives to draw people in, but I think it's all about competing for talent. We've come away since I think in the 70s, when if a woman joined the Foreign Service, they basically and got married, went in the Foreign Service, they had to resign. It just seems bizarre, but that was, maybe a little over 50 years ago that was the case. Now, at least 40% of our Foreign Service is made up of women, and I think our entering level classes are more than 50% women. Our chiefs of mission are at least a third of our ambassadors, and that is continuing to grow every day. But again, it's because we have a solid track record and basically engage women in very important ways in our Foreign Service. But Jen can talk more specifically about women in security, because the embassy has done a lot of work in that regard. Jen.
All right, thank you, sir. I'll be brief for the sake of time. I'd refer folks, if you have a chance to take a look at it, our embassy put together a wonderful presentation through social media and other platforms for Women's History Month that talked about the importance of women in security and defense and how women can become more involved. So I don't know if you have the link for that, but please take a look at that if you're interested. I'd say there's a couple of things for females who may be interested in the security and defense field. Don't be afraid to be the only woman in the room. I've experienced that many times. If you have a passion for a particular field, please go out there and try to pursue that passion. Don't let people tell you that it's not open to you. I'd also, and I try to take this seriously in my own career, as a woman, a female professional in the security and defense field, I think we have a responsibility to pay it forward and help pave the way for additional women to come into the field. So if you are in that field, please take the time to mentor other young professional females who are interested in the field. And always keep an open mind and look for opportunities to help change the system if things need to be changed about the system. Please do that to hopefully make the path a little easier for the women coming forward. So I'll leave it at that. But thank you, Ambassador, for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you again to both of our guest moderators for this timely discussion. We invite our audience to stay engaged and to subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and to make sure you don't miss any of our future events. We encourage you all to stay tuned for our next essential conversation about Canada's peace and security. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.